Now, hey everyone, welcome to Story Mantra. This is the mantra that I have been living my life by for the last 20 years. Storytelling, and nothing but story. Ask my family, and they'll tell you when we watch a movie, I spoil everyone's story. And today we have no one else but oh gosh, he is the pinnacle of master storytelling. Everybody in my family knows him because I carry these two books around wherever I go. I have dog-eared them to death because I literally never leave home without it. And let me tell you, the reason I was able to put a series together, the Winds of Fire series, is because David's books taught me subtle differences, nuances in character in every shape and form, from character change, character growth, motivation, to character desires, needs, fulfillment, wishes, and of course, how to hold your character back from achieving what he or she wants and why, which is organic. I cannot speak enough about David's books and the journey they have taken me on, so I'm going to talk about David. David Corbett is the award-winning author of 6 novels, including The Long-Lost Love Letters of Doc Holliday. Nominated for the Lefty Award for Best Historical Mystery, his work has been nominated for Edgar, Anthony, Barry, Shamus, and the Spine Tingler Awards as well, the last of which he somehow managed to win. Where did that come in from? And his second novel, Done for a Dime, was a New York Times notable book, which Patrick Anderson of the Washington Post described as one of the 3 or 4 best crime novels I have ever read. I'm not surprised. I'm not surprised at all. Corbett's short fiction has twice been selected for Best American Mystery Stories. His nonfiction has appeared in the New York Times Narrative and other outlets, including Writer's Digest. That's where I found David, Writer's Digest. I have been reading this magazine since 2004, and I started going through the articles, and I tear out the ones which are useful for me. And then I started seeing, sorry about interrupting your introduction here, David, but I started seeing David's work in this section called Workbook. And everything that he said just registered with me at a whole different level. I can't even explain it to you. That's how I found David Corbett. David has written 2 writing guides, The Art of Character, A Writer's Bible, and of course, The Compass of Character. So that's The Art of Character, that's The Compass of Character, which I just finished reading. And I may just buy a second one because I've dog-eared that one to death. David has taught at the UCLA Writers Program, Lit Reactor, and at writing conferences across North America, and is a monthly contributor to Writer Unboxed, an award-winning blog dedicated to the craft and business of fiction. So for more, see below the video link. Look below, you'll see David's links and of course the Amazon purchase links to his books, the 2 character books, which I just showed, and of course his other Amazon books on mystery crime fiction, which he's written. Welcome, David. Thank you so much for joining us on Story Mantra.
Thanks for having me, Anju. You're one of my great success stories. There's nothing makes me happier than seeing someone who's either learned from the books or been one of my students to go on to great success. It just warms the little black cockles of my heart.
Well, thank you. I mean, your books are incredible. They broke the barriers for me of a concept which I couldn't understand, which was fleshing out a character. And I think all of us as writers at some point have come across fleshing out a character. And I never understood, what does that actually mean? And this is not going back to, just a few years ago. This is going back several years. And I was trying to understand, how do you flesh out a character? Now you're the master of character development, character arcs. And I wanted you to address something in this book, which has really, really got me thinking all year. And that is character's motivation, because that was my weak point. I'll be honest with you, my character's motivations. Now you talk about the 2 oppositional forces that dictate them. And the biggest break ground concept that I saw in this book was the promise of life versus the protection from the pain of life. Can you talk about that, please?
Well, it starts with an idea of character that turns out to be relatively modern. At least I thought it was. It turns out that it's not quite as modern as I thought. In particular, there's a fellow named Pelagius. in the 4th and 5th centuries. He was a Christian theologian who believed that good works could inspire grace from God, and that each of us could live to fulfill our idea of who we wanted to be and how we wanted to live. This was such a radical idea that he was deemed a heretic. Augustine is famous for challenging him and basically having him run out of the church. So this concept disappeared for almost 1,000 years. It gets resuscitated in the Renaissance. There's a gentleman named Pico della Mirandola who said, I am the artificer of my own life. And what do we mean by that? Well, there has to be some kind of concept of who we want to be and how we want to live. Now, it may be innate. There are some people who seem at very early age to have this flash of insight, a sense of calling as to who they want to be. Judy Garland, supposedly at the age of 2, saw a performance. She came from a vaudeville family, so she was surrounded by performers. But she saw one little girl on the stage who got to do a solo, and she was mesmerized. And the whole family said that when they saw the look on her face and just knew the worm had turned, that Judy Garland would never feel more like herself than when she was on stage. And there's numerous stories of the sort. Other people grow into it. Other people, sometimes it isn't until adolescence, it isn't until they find a career, it isn't until some terrible thing happens in their life where they have to ask the question, what am I doing? Why am I here? What am I supposed to be doing with my life? But once you realize that, there's a sense that my life, I want it to go somewhere and I'm not there yet. And that's the sense that I call lack. There's a sense of unfulfillment, a sense of incompletion. In a certain sense, it's the psychological or emotional equivalent of thirst or hunger or sexual desire, which are constants in our life. Even, we can eat, but that satiety is only temporal. Temporary. And the same thing is true of this notion of who we are. There's always a sense that, well, there's more to be done. I'm not finished yet. There's still something I need to do. And anybody who's ever been a writer knows, that you finish one book and there's always that sense of it never quite lived up to what it seemed it might be when you began. And so there's that sense of a certain sense of emptiness that can only be filled by writing the next book.
The next book, exactly, yeah. And I have to ask you something. So my co-host Lindsay, she couldn't make it today because of issues with internet and power, and she's a reader for literary agents. She reads for them as well. And when I asked her the same question, about characters, she said the same thing. She said the story is all about character. It's about what they want. Sometimes they know it, sometimes they don't know it. And being able to get that on the first page. And that's what, your books talk about. But you talk about the characters' desires, they know what they want. But again, it's short term sometimes. But there's a yearning, which you talk about, which they don't know.
But they don't.
You
know?
Then
again, they don't always know that. Again, now you're quite right. A great many stories are not about a character knowing what they want. It's about them discovering what they want. And very often they discover it by pursuing the wrong thing or pursuing it for wrong reasons. And in failing, in either getting it and realizing they're not satisfied, or in the struggle to get it and not getting it, and having to ask questions, well, why? Well, what's not working here? What's not clicking? They come to some deeper understanding of what it is they truly want from this experience, this situation, this relationship, this family, whatever that major struggle is for them in that book. So almost every story is a learning experience. So there's always going to be growth in that regard, because to learn is to grow and to grow is to change.
right.
The change may not be drastic. It may be just a new normal. But the fact that the character, every book begins with a character facing a question they don't have the answer to yet. Something has happened that is forcing them to act. They don't know whether they're going to succeed or not. But they're compelled either to respond to it because it's a negative thing, or to pursue it. This is where they say that the only two story types are a stranger comes to town or a man goes on a journey. And what they mean by that is what compels the character to act? Is it from something outside that he has to respond to? A stranger comes to town. Or is it something where he finally realizes the opportunity to act on something that he has wanted to do is finally there? And it's sort of a now or never situation. This is the love story. Suddenly the loved one, walks into the room and in some way, or at least you're intrigued enough that you want to begin the pursuit. So these two things, the desire to act can be triggered by either something that from outside or inside. And a character may not know completely why they're pursuing it at first. They may, in fact, just have a initial, all they want to do is get things back to normal. But if your story is structured right, if the problem is big enough, that's never going to happen. They always have to somehow now go on a journey of discovery to figure out, well, since I can't return things to the past, how can I make the future in a way that gratifies even this, whether it's clear or unclear, some sense of things have to get better. How can I do that? And they take steps toward that.
So let me ask you something. I mean,
Sure.
because this is something Lindsay brought up in a previous, conversation we had with, and I can't remember who it is now, but it was a very deep insight into the fact that before, for example, if you were looking to sign on with an agent, they were willing to consider the first 10 to 15 or 20 pages of your work and then decide whether they want to take on the manuscript or not. Now, she said, it's reined in a lot tighter. Now they'll only give you 3 pages, or if you're lucky, that's 3 pages. Otherwise, it's the first 3 to 4 paragraphs. That's how tight, some of the literary agents have become. How do we bring that yearning and longing into our manuscript on page 1 when there's a story of discovery awaiting and the character is sometimes aware or not aware of what she needs or wants, and we've only got, say, a page now to do this and get it on the first page?
You either have to reveal or hint at the crisis that the character is about to face in that first couple pages, or you have to, through the character's voice, create a sense of intrigue that automatically hooks the reader going, I want to know more about this person. And there's no single way to go about that. For example, the novel that I'm marketing right now, the first line is, I do not consider life a triumph any more than I don't consider death a tragedy any more than I regard life a triumph. Life gets lived, then it doesn't. There's the miracle if you find yourself in search of one, or in need of one, excuse me. Then again, if it's the miraculous you're after, allow me to introduce Georgina Chantrea Saint Victoire. So right away, I'm showing that this character cares about somebody else. He has a rather extreme view of life, but he cares about somebody else. So it's like intrigue and and empathy. If you can, in the first first few paragraphs, first page of your story, reveal your main character, create a sense of intrigue, what might happen, and I want to know what it is, and a sense of empathy. We're going to care about that character, and one of the greatest ways to do that is show them caring about somebody else. Another great example of that is Everdeen Kitness in The Hunger Games. First paragraph has her waking up and immediately reaching over in the bed for her sister and discovering she's not there.
Prim.
And feeling afraid. But then she remembers, oh no, she would have slept with mother tonight because this is the day. I think it's the reckoning. Isn't that what they call it?
The reckoning, that's right. Yeah. District 9 or something.
Yeah. And so right away you're kind of, well, what the heck is that? What is this reckoning? So she's posed a really significant question. Yeah. But she's also been revealed as a caring person. So right away we have empathy and we have intrigue. So I would say that if especially if they're only giving you 3 pages, right now I've been lucky that the most limited anybody's limit constraint for me has been, I think, 10. But most of the agents I'm contacting give you 50.
Right.
And I just had an agent ask, for the rest of it, because I changed agents because this next book is so different from what I've done before. And so that would be my advice. But also it's something that doesn't get discussed enough is how to embody your character in the character's voice.
How to embody your what?
To embody the character in that character's voice. How to create the language that sort of illuminates them simply by the way they convey themselves.
Right.
It's a really hard thing to teach. Voice is something a lot of people think you can't teach it, that you either have it or you don't. I had a friend, the same James Fry, who I've mentioned before with you. He had an exercise, and I actually mentioned it in The Art of Character, was whenever he saw that there were writers who seemed to have very flat prose, not much of an authorial voice, he would tell them, go to a book that you love. And for a half hour every morning, type out word for word, comma by comma, period by period, everything in that. And what happens, and it's an odd little trick, you don't imitate them. And this is the interesting connection between reading and writing. What happens is the part of you that is active in writing, the typing, the putting it down on the page begins to connect with the reader part of you, which is rich with language.
Right.
And what he found is that then after that half hour, once these writers turn to their own work, it usually took a couple of months, but they began to really have that connection between that part of them that was rich because of their reading was finally getting down into their fingertips and into their writing.
Writing. So it's connected for sure.
And I think that I hear agents so often say the thing that I miss so often in manuscripts is a distinct voice. And for example, your story is so rich in that regard because you immerse yourself so deeply in not just the character, but also the milieu. I mean, it comes alive so immediately.
The story world?
Yeah, yours.
Really?
I'm sorry. The book you gave me to read. I'm sorry.
Beauty and Desire.
Yeah, thank you.
I've been living in that world for so many years. I find it hard, to hear somebody else say they were immersed in it because I've been living in that world for like 20 years now.
Well, this is another sad truth, is that we will never read our books the way a reader comes to them.
Yeah.
We know everything we took out. And that's another great truth, which is Joshua Moore said this once, and it just went off in my head. And that is, learn to respect the pages the readers will never see.
All the deletes, all the hidden scenes.
All that stuff that you did and went, no, got to get rid of it. Got to get rid of it. It's not wasted. That's called writing.
So
and go ahead.
Help me understand then, and I really appreciate you bringing up my book because that was like dealing with an elephant in a room. Honestly, at that time, I didn't know whether I was dealing with the tail or the ear or the trunk. It was just this massive, massive story, which had to be told. And, when I started reading this book here, The Compass of Character, what came out to me was one thing which you brought out, which was hiding, learning to hide things as well. That's what characters are so good at doing without knowing it, which is what we as people do. Dialogue which says everything, but just says and touches on the periphery, but the real meaning is hidden. And you address that in The Art of Character.
Well, that's subtext. And you always, the importance of subtext is it creates intrigue. And you have to remember that very few people open themselves up completely. We all know what it's like to be rejected. We all know what it's like to be misunderstood. We all know what it's like to be betrayed. And in almost every social situation, unless it's with someone you trust implicitly, you're reading the room, as it were, as well as you're talking. And as long as you can remember that your character, in doing whatever they're doing in a scene, it has opposition. There's always another character in that scene pushing back for whatever reason. And if they're communicating to that character, or even acting that character, they're constantly testing. It's not just, they're not just stating, they're testing. And you have to remember that dialogue is action in that regard. And if you can understand the underlying action, are they trying to persuade? Are they trying to dominate? Are they trying to negotiate? Are they trying to flatter? Are they trying to insult? Are they trying to demean and dominate? Or are they seducing? It isn't unless you understand, okay, so what's the underlying action that they're trying to accomplish with their words? And then, well, what's keeping them from being successful at that? Something about the other character is making it difficult. So given that difficulty, how do they adjust what they're saying or doing to continue trying to get what they want despite that opposition? And that little mechanic is where subtext comes in. It's always often a really powerful tool as well to give your character a secret. And the reason is, once you create a secret for a character, they automatically have an inside and an outside. You've by some weird little magic created depth.
Let me ask, how do we do that in the opening? How do we create that secret in the opening to keep the intrigue?
I don't know that you need to. Like I said, you can't tell your entire story at once. You can't put everything on the first page, and you shouldn't try. I mean, the first part of the story really is basically orienting the reader in your story world, but you have to do it in such a way that from the get-go, they feel, oh, wow, I'm already in. Now, this is relatively new. I mean, look at Lord of the Rings.
Oh, yeah.
And you talk about a slow introduction. And you see this a lot in the fantasy world, but there's so much world building to be done that they're not as obsessed with kicking the story off immediately, like you are in crime and thriller fiction, where supposedly you need the dead body on by page 2 where you failed, which I find ludicrous, but I've actually heard that said at writers' conferences by people who don't write. But the problem is that agents are inundated, so they're getting pickier, and the competition is harder. There's more and more people writing, and people are getting better at it. So you do have to, make sure that you have something intriguing and a character worth caring about on the first page. And by caring about, I don't mean that you need to be in love with the character. I just think in some way there has to be something fascinating about the character that becomes self-apparent right away. But if a character has a secret, the only way you're going to understand that immediately is if they're behaving in a way that makes it look as though they're not being entirely honest with others. And that would be hard to do right away until you know, well, what's the truth? Excuse me, my phone's ringing, but it'll stop right now.
But, well, that's interesting, because the only way you know that the character is not telling the truth is if you have another character who's giving their version of the truth, for example. Or?
Well, remember that if a character has a secret, and then the issue is, well, are you going to reveal it to the reader or not? Sometimes, there was one book where I was having a typical protagonist problem. He just wasn't compelling enough. He was too good a guy. So I had to create a nasty secret, something he didn't want anyone else to know about him. And he was the youngest of 3 brothers. They were actually cousins, but they were raised in a family, so considered themselves brothers. And having been raised in a family of brothers, I knew that there's a lot of buried anger, because they're always on you. They're always picking on you. They're always, just shoving stuff down your throat. And he had learned to basically, the path of last resistance with his brothers was the best path without getting his butt kicked. But there was one time when that, he did something cruel himself to somebody else. He's very ashamed of that. But when I saw that, when I envisioned that scene, he automatically became more complicated and more interesting. And writing from that place made him more interesting on the page. I don't know. And even though I never disclosed it to the reader, but it somehow made him more complicated and more real to me. And writing from that more complicated, real place made him more interesting on the page. It just worked out that way.
Just worked out. Well, we have to end this session because there's just so much to ask you, David. I wouldn't know where to go from here. There's just openings, and chapter ones are just, the crux of every writer's journey. So we're going to come back next week with David again, going to talk more about opening chapters and motivation, and deal more now with pursuing the promise of life and protection from the pain of life. But thank you so much, David, for joining us on Story Mantra. I'm a huge fan of your books, and I want everyone to grab their copy. So remember, just down there is the link, the purchase link for David's books. And thank you for being with us, David.
Thank you, Anju, for inviting me.
Thank you.